Alright, buckle up, because we're about to take a trip back about 5,000 years. And I'm not talking about a little history lesson with dates and names you'll forget by tomorrow. No. We're going all the way back to a time when most of the world was still figuring out how to plant wheat. And one group of people, right smack in the middle of what we now call Iraq, had already built something that would blow your mind. Cities. Real, actual cities. With streets, with houses, with markets and temples and neighborhoods and drama. Oh yeah, plenty of drama. Because some things never change, am I right? We're talking about ancient Sumer, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a place so fertile, so ridiculously productive, that people looked at it and said, you know what, let's stay here, let's build something.
Lift it
And
higher,
build they
place
did.
it there.
Like, seriously, these folks didn't mess around. Now here's the thing that really gets me every single time I think about this. When most of us imagine ancient people, we picture, I don't know, caves, animal skins, grunting at each other. But the Sumerians, they were out here with multi-story buildings, organized neighborhoods, sewage systems, yes, sewage systems, and a full-on urban lifestyle that in many ways looks surprisingly familiar. Does that not just send a little shiver down your spine? Because it should. So let's walk those ancient streets together. Let's knock on those mud brick doors. Let's see who's home. Let's get one thing straight right out of the gate. Sumer wasn't just the first civilization. It was the blueprint. Everything that came after, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and eventually us, owes something to what those people built between roughly 3,500 and 2000 BC. That's a run of over 1,000 years of continuous civilization. For context, the United States has been around for less than 250. Just let that sink in for a second. The cities of Sumer, places like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, and Kish, were not just settlements. They were organized, complex, functioning urban centers with everything that implies. Government, religion, commerce, art, conflict, gossip, all of it. And Uruk? Oh, Uruk was the big one. By around 3100 BC, Uruk had a population estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. That's not a village, that's not a town. That is a full-on city, my friends. One of the largest human concentrations on Earth at that time, surrounded by a massive wall stretching nearly 10 kilometers. The legendary King Gilgamesh was said to have built those walls. And even if the story got a little stretched in the telling, because you know how stories get, the walls were absolutely real. Archaeologists have found them. So what did it feel like to walk through the gates of Uruk back then? What did you see? What did you smell? Let me paint you a picture. First thing you'd notice, it's loud and busy. And honestly, a little chaotic in the best possible way. These cities weren't built on some neat grid like modern Manhattan. They grew organically, the way cities do when people are just trying to live their lives. Streets curving, winding, neighborhoods clustering around temples and markets, alleys branching off in every direction like the roots of a tree. But here's the thing that surprises most people. There was still an underlying order to it. A logic. The Sumerians knew what they were doing. At the center of any major Sumerian city, dominating the skyline and the soul of the community, was the ziggurat. Think of it as a massive stepped pyramid made of sun-dried mud bricks, not sharp-edged and polished like the Egyptian pyramids, but broad and layered, rising up in terraces with a temple at the very top. This wasn't just a religious building. The ziggurat was the heart of the city. It was where the gods lived, or at least where people believed the gods touched down when they visited Earth. The priests and priestesses who lived and worked in and around the ziggurat complex held enormous power. They managed grain stores, organized labor, kept records, and basically ran what we'd call the bureaucracy of the city. Can you imagine? The accountants of ancient Sumer were also the clergy. I mean, does that not hit different? Radiating out from the ziggurat were the major streets, wide enough for carts and donkeys, lined with the workshops and stalls of merchants and craftspeople. Potters, weavers, metalworkers, leather tanners, brewers. Yes, brewers. And we'll get to that. All doing their thing, calling out to customers, haggling over prices, complaining about the heat.
It has a blemish here.
Because in Mesopotamia in the summer, it gets hot, like really hot, like over 110 degrees Fahrenheit hot. And these people were building cities in the middle of it. Respect. The further you moved from the center, the more residential the streets became. Quieter, narrower, more intimate, more alive with the sounds of families and neighbors and ordinary daily life. And it's here, in these neighborhoods, in these homes, where things get really interesting. Now I know what you might be thinking. Mud bricks. Really? That sounds like something you'd build a sandcastle out of, not a civilization. But hold on, because a mud brick, called adobe in many cultures, is actually an incredibly smart building material for that environment. It's cheap, it's everywhere, it's easy to work with, and most importantly, it keeps you cool inside when it's blazing hot outside. These people knew what they were doing. A typical Sumerian house in a city like Ur or Uruk was built around a central courtyard. You'd come in through a narrow doorway from the street, and that doorway was intentionally small and angled, designed to block both the direct sun and the eyes of curious neighbors. Privacy was a value. The Sumerians understood the assignment. Once inside, you'd find yourself in that central courtyard, open to the sky, maybe with a tree or two for shade. This courtyard was the lungs of the house. It's where cooking happened, where kids played, where the family gathered in the evenings when the air finally started to cool down. Around the courtyard were the rooms, sleeping quarters, a reception room for guests, storage, sometimes a small chapel-like space for household religious rituals. Because the Sumerians weren't just religious in public at the temple. They brought religion home with them. Little figurines of protective spirits, what they called house gods, would be placed in niches in the walls to watch over the family. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a lucky charm, except they took it very, very seriously. Wealthier families had two-story homes, with the upper floor used as sleeping quarters, and the ground floor for daily activities. The rooftop was prime real estate. Flat, accessible by a ladder or narrow staircase, and used for sleeping during those unbearably hot summer nights. If you've ever been somewhere so hot you couldn't sleep inside and just needed air, you get it. You totally get it. Now here's something that genuinely gets me every time, and I think it'll get you too. Some homes in the city of Ur had their own private drainage systems, channels built right into the floor, sloping toward a central drain that fed into a larger city drainage network. These weren't wealthy mansions. These were ordinary middle-class homes. In 2500 BC, does that not just knock your socks off? Because for a long time, historians assumed that kind of infrastructure was a much later development. Turns out the Sumerians were way ahead of the curve. Okay, let's get back out on the street. Because the streets of Sumer are where life really happened. Picture a narrow lane, maybe 3 or 4 meters wide, paved in some areas with flat stones or compressed rubble, though many streets were just packed dirt that turned to mud when the irrigation canals overflowed, which happened regularly. The streets were shaded in places by the upper floors of buildings that jutted out overhead, almost touching each other across the alley. That's smart architecture right there. Built-in shade in a city where shade was survival. The smell? Okay, let's be real. It was probably intense. Donkeys, goats, and dogs roamed freely. Waste disposal wasn't exactly what you'd call modern, but there were also the smells of baking bread and roasting meat and fermenting beer drifting out of courtyards, and the heavy, sweet smell of incense burning at the neighborhood shrines on every corner. It was a full sensory experience, let me tell you. The streets were busy at all hours. Dawn brought the water carriers and the bakers and the field workers heading out. Midday, the streets went quiet, too hot, everyone retreating inside or under whatever shade they could find. Late afternoon and evening, that's when the city came alive. Markets reopened. People visited neighbors. Music drifted from certain establishments. The temple drums might start up as priests prepared for evening rituals.
See how
And
fat this
speaking
one
of
is,
markets,
lady?
Yes, they look good.
markets.
I'll take
If
these
you wanted
three.
to understand Sumerian society, you went to the market. You'd find stalls selling fresh fish from the river, dried dates and figs, live poultry, boats of woven
Notice
wool
the gold
and linen,
flecks,
pottery in
symbolizing
every
the
shape and
stars
size,
themselves.
bronze
Truly a
tools
treasure,
and weapons,
unmatched in the
jewelry
market.
made of gold and lapis lazuli. That gorgeous deep blue stone they imported all the way from what is now Afghanistan. Trade networks in 3000 BC connecting Sumer to Central Asia. I mean, honestly, what can you even say to that? As they say, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, here's where it gets really juicy. Because Sumerian cities weren't just places, they were societies. Layered, complex, sometimes deeply unequal societies that in some uncomfortable ways look a lot like ours. At the top of the social pyramid were the temple priests and priestesses, the palace officials, and the great merchants. These were the people with land, with resources, with power. They lived in the bigger houses near the center of the city, ate better food, wore finer clothes, and had their names written in records that survived thousands of years for us to read today. Then there was the middle layer, the craftspeople, the shopkeepers, the scribes, the farmers who owned their own land. These were the backbone of Sumerian urban life. They worked hard, they raised families, they worried about taxes and harvests, and whether their kids were going to amount to anything. You know the type. You might even be the type. And then there were the lower classes, laborers, servants, people who worked the temple lands or the fields of wealthy landowners for rations of grain and beer rather than wages. Life was harder there. The system wasn't always fair. The Sumerians actually had laws, including some of the world's earliest written legal codes that theoretically protected the poor and the vulnerable.
20 shekels of
practice,
silver.
The count is
Well,
exact.
Let's just
As
say the
agreed.
gap between
May your
theory
pride
and
be
practice is not a
prosperous.
modern invention. But here's something that might surprise you. Women in ancient Sumer had significantly more legal rights than women in many later ancient civilizations. Sumerian women could own property. They could run businesses. They could go to court. They could brew and sell beer, which was actually one of the most common and respected small businesses in Sumerian cities, often run by women.
They say the
There
shipment
were
from the
female
south was
tavern
lost in the
keepers
storm.
all over
Lost?
these cities,
Nonsense.
and
I
their
heard they simply
establishments were
rerouted
social
to avoid the
hubs
toll.
where
That would
people
explain
gathered
the
to
prices
drink,
in the market.
eat, exchange news, and, let's be honest, talk about everybody else's business. Does that remind you of anywhere? Because it should. I know. You're probably like, did they really have to bring up beer? But yes, we absolutely have to bring up beer. Because beer in ancient Sumer wasn't just a drink. It was civilization. It was nutrition. It was currency. It was culture. It was in many ways the reason cities worked. Sumerian beer, called kaz in their language, was thick, cloudy, and relatively low in alcohol compared to modern beer. It
This
was
mark here
nutritious,
indicates a 3-year
calorie-dense,
fermentation. It's our
and
finest
safe
barley
to
wine.
drink in
And
a
the smaller
world
jug,
where
is it the
water
same
sources
vintage?
could
No,
be
that is a younger
contaminated.
honey mead, much sweeter.
Workers on massive construction projects, temples, city walls, irrigation systems were often paid partly in beer rations. It was the energy
O
drink
great
and the
Enlil,
paycheck all
whose
at once.
commands are high and
There were
holy,
multiple
whose
varieties
words
of
are
beer,
steadfast.
different recipes for different occasions, different strengths for different purposes. The Sumerians even had a goddess specifically for beer, Ninkasi. And the hymn to Ninkasi, written around 1800 BC, is not just a religious text. It's also a detailed recipe for how to brew beer. A recipe in a hymn to a goddess. That's the Sumerian vibe, and I am here for it. Picture the local tavern on a side street in low tables, clay cups, a woman behind the counter managing the jars and the customers and the chaos. Groups of off-duty workers, and scribes and merchants sitting around, drinking their cards through long straws, because the grain and hops floating on top made it easier to drink that way. arguing about politics, complaining about their bosses, sharing the latest rumors about what the king was up to. Does that not sound like every neighborhood bar you've ever been to? Some things, my friend, are genuinely timeless. All right, let's talk about the next generation. Because you can't have a civilization without education, and the Sumerians figured that out early. In the cities of Sumer, there were schools, actual schools, called the Eduba, which literally means tablet house. These were institutions where boys from relatively well-off families went to learn the art of writing. And when we say writing, we mean cuneiform, that system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets that the Sumerians invented. And that is, as far as we know, the earliest form of writing on Earth. Learning cuneiform was hard. It involved hundreds of different signs, combinations, and uses.
Far better work than this from
Students
you.
spent years copying texts, memorizing sign lists, learning to write in multiple languages, because educated Sumerians were often bilingual or trilingual, writing in Sumerian and Akkadian, and sometimes other languages depending on the era and region. The dropout rate must have been brutal. We actually have clay tablets that are essentially ancient school exercises, lists of words, copied texts, even some that scholars have identified as the ancient equivalent of math homework. And here's the part that always gets me. We also have tablets that contain what appear to be complaints from teachers about lazy students. 5,000 years ago, some scribe teacher was writing down his frustration about the kid who didn't do his homework. Some things never change, huh? As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Not all children went to school, of course. Most kids, especially girls, were educated at home, learning the trade of their family. If your father was a potter, you learned pottery. If your mother ran the weaving workshop, you learned to weave. If your family brewed beer, well, you probably learned to brew beer. Practical, skill-based education that kept the city's economy running generation after generation. Now, you can't walk even half a block in a Sumerian city without bumping into religion. And I mean that almost literally. Every neighborhood had its local shrine. Every home had its household deities. The great temples at the center of the city cast a shadow, figuratively and spiritually, over everything. The Sumerian religious world was packed. Hundreds of gods and goddesses, each with specific domains and personalities and needs. Anu, the sky god, distant, authoritative, not exactly the approachable type. Enlil, wind god, powerful, kind of unpredictable. The sort of deity you really didn't want to get on the wrong side of. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, clever, inventive, occasionally a little mischievous. Inanna, Inanna, goddess of love, desire, war, and power. One of the most complex and fascinating divine figures in any mythology anywhere. More on her in a minute. The relationship between the Sumerians and their gods wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. These gods weren't portrayed as loving parents watching over humanity. They were more like powerful bosses who needed to be kept happy. You fed them. Literally through daily offerings of food and drink at the temple. You worked for them. The temple was the largest economic